James and Mia had always dreamed of finding a home, a place where their children could grow up surrounded by peace, stability, and safety. Their previous apartment life had been full of cramped spaces, constantly moving to make ends meet. Now, with years of hard work, sacrifices, and determination, they had finally achieved their goal. This apartment complex, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, seemed to be everything they had longed for. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when they pulled into the parking lot of their new complex. The air was warm, but not oppressive, and the sky above seemed endless. Tall trees lined the streets, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. A playground was located in the center of the complex, surrounded by open green spaces where children could play freely. The sight felt like something out of a dream. This was it, the new beginning they'd hoped for. The apartment itself was even better than they'd imagined. Spacious and full of natural light, it had large windows, giving them a view of the lush greenery outside. The walls were fresh, and the floors were spotless. It felt like a blank canvas, ready to be filled with the love and memories of their family. As James carried the first box up to their third-floor apartment, his daughter Tiana, who was 10, eagerly ran ahead to explore their new home. Luke, their 6-year-old son, followed behind her, clutching his favorite toy car. Mia smiled at them as she placed another box down in the living room, feeling grateful for this moment. But just as James was about to step into the elevator, he noticed a figure standing a few feet away. The woman, appearing to be in her 60s, had tightly pulled back gray hair, a bun sitting neatly at the top of her head. Her piercing blue eyes narrowed as she scanned James from head to toe. A suspicious expression plastered across her face. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that was sharp, her tone colder than the air in the hallway. James paused, slightly surprised by the interruption. He had been hoping for a peaceful start, but this wasn't quite what he'd envisioned. He offered a polite smile, trying to make the encounter as brief as possible. "Yes, ma'am," he asked. The woman did not smile in return. She seemed to be sizing him up. "Where are you going?" she asked sharply, crossing her arms. "I've lived here for years, and I've never seen you before. Are you sure you belong here?" James felt a knot form in his stomach. He had expected the usual questions, directions perhaps, or neighbors offering a warm welcome, but this woman's words were laced with something else, something unfamiliar and unwelcoming. "Yes, ma'am. We just moved in. Apartment 305, he said, gesturing toward the door. The woman's eyes narrowed further, her lips pressing into a thin line. She muttered, unconvinced, "I'll be watching." Her words were delivered with a finality that made James feel both uncomfortable and unwelcome. She turned on her heel and walked away without another glance, leaving him standing in the hallway, unsure of how to proceed. He stood there for a few moments, letting her words settle in. It was not the greeting he had hoped for, but he didn't want to make a scene. Shrugging it off, he made his way upstairs to the apartment, where Mia was busy unpacking. When he told Mia about the strange encounter, she frowned. "That's odd," she said, her brow furrowed. "Maybe she's just one of those people who likes to know who's around. But you're right. It does feel off." Mia had always been the optimistic one, and though James appreciated her reassuring words, a lingering discomfort gnawed at him. The next morning, the tension between them seemed to intensify. Mia was in the living room organizing the kids' toys, and James was carrying another box, when the woman, now identified as Mrs. Peters, appeared once again in the hallway. This time she was standing directly outside their apartment door, her arms folded across her chest, her gaze fixed on James as though she had been waiting for him. "Excuse me," she called out again, her voice colder than ever. James, growing increasingly uncomfortable, stopped in his tracks. He put the box down beside him and turned to face her. "Yes? I told you yesterday that I didn't recognize you," Mrs. Peters said, her voice sharp, "and I still don't trust you. I don't think you belong here. People like you always find a way into places like this, but I'm not buying it." James froze. The words hit him like a slap in the face. His mind raced. What was she implying? "Excuse me?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "I'm telling you, I live here. We signed the lease. I can show you the paperwork if you want." His voice was firm, but there was an edge of disbelief in it. How could she accuse him like this? Mrs. Peters didn't back down. "I've been living here for years," she spat, her expression full of disdain. I know everyone in this building. You don't belong here." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I'll make sure the building manager knows about you." James could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced back at Mia, who had just stepped into the hallway, her face flushed with anger as she heard the end of Mrs. Peters' accusations. "What is your problem?" Mia demanded, stepping in front of James. "We live here. You have no right to treat us like this." Mrs. Peters simply shrugged, turning away from them with a dismissive flick of her hand. "I'll deal with it later," she muttered, before walking off. Mia's voice quivered with emotion. "This is ridiculous. We just moved in, and this is the welcome we get. Who does she think she is?" James felt a wave of frustration wash over him. "I'm going to the building manager. This can't go on. This is our home, and she can't treat us like this." The confrontation left them both shaken, but they knew they had to address it. They went straight to Laura, the building manager, who listened carefully to their story. Laura, in her 40s, was a kind and professional woman with a warm smile that made James and Mia feel comfortable. But when she heard what Mrs. Peters had done, her expression grew serious. "I'm so sorry this happened," Laura said, shaking her head. "This kind of behavior will not be tolerated in this building. I'll handle it. You should never feel unwelcome in your own home." James and Mia were relieved by Laura's response. Still, they couldn't shake the unsettling feeling of being targeted. They had hoped for a peaceful community, and yet it felt like they were being scrutinized by a neighbor they hadn't even met. Over the next few days, Mrs. Peters's behavior only worsened. Every time James and Mia would pass her in the hallway, her eyes would narrow, and her gaze would linger a little too long. James could feel the tension in the air, and it felt as though everyone was watching them. The other residents of the building seemed to avoid eye contact, leaving James to wonder if they too were suspicious of him and his family. Despite all this, James and Mia pushed forward. They couldn't afford to let one person's prejudice dictate their happiness. They continued settling in, decorating the walls with family pictures and organizing their belongings to create a warm, inviting atmosphere. It wasn't just a house. It was their home. But one evening, a week later, as James was carrying a heavy box into the apartment, Laura called him. She told him that she had spoken with Mrs. Peters and had issued a formal warning about her behavior. "I made it very clear," Laura said firmly, "that this kind of discrimination will not be tolerated." She understands now. James and Mia were relieved, but they also felt the weight of what had happened. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was rooted in something deeper. Mrs. Peters's behavior was a stark reminder that prejudice still existed, even in places they thought would offer them peace. Time passed, and while things seemed to settle down, Mrs. Peters's attitude remained unchanged. She would nod curtly at James and Mia when they passed her in the hallway, but it was always with an air of disapproval. Her once constant glare had softened slightly, but it was clear she still harbored judgment. Then, one morning, James found Mrs. Peters standing outside her door, looking uncomfortable. When she saw him, she hesitated before speaking. "I wanted to apologize," Mrs. Peters said, her voice quieter than usual. I realize I was wrong. I've been living here so long, and I was so set in my ways. I shouldn't have said those things to you and your family." James was taken aback by the apology. He had expected her to hold firm in her beliefs. He studied her for a moment, then nodded cautiously. "Thank you. It means something that you can admit when you're wrong." But the hurt from those initial encounters lingered, and James couldn't erase the memory of how it felt to be judged and mistrusted for no reason other than his race. "I'm trying," Mrs. Peters continued. "I'm working on changing. It's not easy, but I know it's the right thing to do." James smiled softly. "It's a start," he said. "That's all anyone can do." As Mrs. Peters returned to her apartment, James couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet closure. While things would never be perfect, he knew that standing up for themselves had mattered. The experience had shown him the importance of persistence, of standing firm even in the face of discomfort. It was a reminder that things could change, even when it seemed impossible. In the end, the moral was clear. Change didn't happen overnight, but small steps, conversations, actions, and standing up for what was right had the power to shift the narrative. James and Mia had fought for their right to belong, and in doing so, they had helped create a space where they could finally feel at home. It wasn't easy, but they had made it through. Together, they had found peace.